So welcome, Massimo. Thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. It'd be great if we be in person, maybe next year, as you said. But for now, let's see what we can do with this medium. So what I'd like to talk to you guys today is, in fact, what Stoic philosophy has to say helpful about a pandemic. Not directly. A lot of the Stoics did not really write about pandemics, although there were actually several of them did experience something like what we're going through, and as I'll explain in a minute. But there are some tools that Stoic philosophy provides in general to deal with adversity and setbacks that are particularly useful also in the middle of a situation like the one we're finding ourselves in. So first of all, we should acknowledge that pandemics, plagues, and things like that are not at all a new phenomenon, right? This is, I mean, we hear about the fact that this is a once in a century kind of thing, although that remains to be seen. But even once in a century, that means that there's been many occasions like this before. Other people have gone through these kind of hardships before. And in fact, right there, remembering, bringing to mind the fact that this is not a new situation, that other people have gone through it and have, you know, some of them have survived and thrived and recovered from it. That actually in and of itself is a Stoic exercise, sometimes referred to as the view from above. Like, you know, try to zoom out from our specific situation in the moment. We all get caught up into the specifics of what's happening right now. But, you know, if you pause for a minute and zoom back and say, hey, actually this stuff has happened to other people before and a lot of people have coped with it, then it becomes a little bit easier to deal with it. In fact, several philosophers involved with Stoicism and also several writers have been through it. Let me give you just a small list. Socrates, back around 430 before the current era, survived a plague in Athens in the middle of the Peloponnesian War. And Socrates was, of course, a direct inspiration for much of Greek and Roman philosophy, including Stoicism. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who was a Stoic, handled what is known as the Antonine Plague that hit the Roman Empire from 165 to about 180 of the current era. That plague killed 4 to 5 million people, including eventually Marcus himself. But, you know, he had to deal with it not only at a personal level. He lost a brother, for instance, as a result of the plague. But he also had to deal with it as a leader of, you know, an entire empire. Skip forward to the Renaissance. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron while it was in the countryside outside of Florence during the bubonic plague of 1348. Skip another couple of centuries, and Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet while London's theaters were closed during the plague of 1593. Now, I'm giving you these examples not because I want to raise the bar too much. So I don't want you to feel guilty if you don't go out and write the book, you know, the Decameron or Romeo and Juliet, or become a Socrates or an emperor. But the point is, this kind of stuff has happened before, and some people have been able to not only to you know, deal with it and sort of endure it, but in fact even thrive and even get things done that they wouldn't have done, been able to do otherwise, or not as easily. This also explains this notion that a lot of people in the past have been through pandemics and have written about pandemics. Also explains the popularity during our pandemic, during the COVID situation, of works of fiction like Albert Camus' The Plague, Jean-Paul Sartre's No Exit, Philip Roth's Nemesis, and Boccaccio's own Decameron. What do these books have in common? Well, they all talk about the plague from the point of view of different human beings and different human experiences. And it's always a good, as I said, psychologically good to go back to these books, because they are, even though they're fiction, they remind us of what happens to people under similar conditions, and we can sympathize or even empathize with those people because we're going through the same thing ourselves, and that gives comfort and makes us reflect more widely about our experiences. Now, specifically about Stoicism, I want to suggest that going through a plague or a pandemic or something like that is not very different from a kind of thing that happened very frequently in ancient times, and that several Stoic philosophers experienced directly, and that is being sent into exile. One of the worst punishments that there were pretty much two punishments that you could suffer in ancient Greece or Rome. You could either be put to death, or you could be sent into exile. Now, I take it a lot of people would prefer to be sent into exile rather than being sentenced to death. But being sent into exile was a rather difficult thing. It was difficult to cope with it. So there's a large literature in ancient times about what happens when you're sent into exile. Why? Well, there are lots of similarities between being sent into exile and having to endure a pandemic. For instance, your movements are were highly restricted. You couldn't go anywhere you wanted if you were in exile. You couldn't travel often, just like there are travel restrictions and restrictions on where we can go during the COVID period. It was hard or impossible to see friends and family. Seneca and Marcus Aurelius didn't have Zoom. So we're kind of lucky that we can at least rely on modern technology. But even so, of course, the contact is limited, right? So they were writing letters to each other, but they might not see each other for years. And then finally, the range of your activities was seriously diminished. It was seriously curtailed because there were certain things. You had less money available, for instance. Your property often was confiscated. So the kinds of things you could do were actually fairly limited. Now, because of the frequency and impact of being sent into exile, several Stoic philosophers actually wrote about their experiences under these conditions. Seneca, who was a first century senator and imperial advisor to the Emperor Nero, was sent into exile by a previous emperor, Claudius, to the island of Corsica. Now, if you look up Corsica today, you'll see that it's a resort island, and it's like you can imagine, it's like, well, what's the big deal about being sent into exile to Corsica? It's just beautiful. But at the time, it was a pretty rugged place. It was not exactly what it is today. So he had a hard time there. Another Stoic philosopher, first century Stoic philosopher, Musonius Rufus, was sent into exile twice by two different emperors, Nero and Vespasian. And on one occasion, he was sent to a little Aegean island called Gyaros in Greece. And he described that island as being, quote, harsh and devoid of human culture. In fact, that island has been used to send political dissidents in exile for like centuries, all the way up until the 1970s, when in Greece there was a regime of military regime, and political dissidents were sent to Gyara even then. Epictetus, who was another late first century, early second century Stoic philosopher, and in fact was a student of Musonius, was also sent into exile by yet another emperor, Domitian. You might wonder why all these emperors were sending Stoics into exile. And the reason is that philosophers in general, but Stoics in particular, had this nasty habit of, as we would say today, speaking truth to power. And power usually doesn't like to be spoken truth to. And so some of these people were killed, in fact, and others were sent into exile. Now, in the case of Epictetus, things actually went pretty well because he was sent to Nicopolis in northwestern Greece, where he actually reestablished his school, and that school became one of the most famous of antiquity. And so there is another example of somebody actually, making lemonade out of lemons, basically, and having been able to flourish under conditions of adversity. Now, for the rest of the time that we have, I'd like to focus on two particular Stoic philosophers, Seneca and Epictetus, and especially Seneca, because he writes a lot about exile. In fact, he wrote 3 letters of consolation to two friends and one to his mother, Helvia. And I'm going to talk to you about the letter that Seneca wrote to his mother, because it is particularly interesting and touching. And it is about consoling her for his situation, right? So she was distraught because Seneca had been sent into exile, and he was there alone without family and friends and so on and so forth. And so she was distraught by it. And so here's what Seneca writes to his mother, Helvia. He says, early on in the letter, he starts out by reminding her that she herself has actually suffered quite a bit in life, and that such suffering had prepared her to withstand new blows that fortune might bring to her, including her son being sent into exile. So he writes, and I quote, "Let those whose minds have been enervated by a long period of happiness weep and lament for many days and faint away on receiving the slightest blow. But those whose years have all been passed amid catastrophes should bear the severest losses with brave and unyielding patience." So he's basically said, look, your life has actually prepared you to withstand adversity. This is what you're a courageous woman. You can do this. You can get through this. He tells his mother that what she has suffered in the past has prepared her because she has learned from her experiences. You know, we often say that people become older and therefore become wiser. That doesn't follow. You can become older and not being an iota wiser than you were when you were younger. You become wiser not just because you age and you accumulate experience, but because you reflect on those experiences. You try to learn from those experiences. If you don't, then you don't become wiser at all. But Seneca says to his mother, you have gained nothing by so many misfortunes if you have not learned how to suffer. So one of the things that you do learn is that, you know, misfortunes happen, setbacks happen, stuff that we don't like happens, and we have to deal with it. Now, Seneca then writes about his general take on adversity as a Stoic, and he basically launches into a mini lesson in Stoic philosophy, which is kind of the point of the letter that he's writing to his mother. And he says, external circumstances have very little importance either for good or for evil. The wise person is neither elated by prosperity nor depressed by adversity, for they have always endeavored to depend chiefly upon themselves and to derive all their joys from themselves. What Seneca is saying there is that happiness, in a sense, it's an inside job, meaning that it comes from within, not from without. Sure, external circumstances can be, setting us back, and they can be difficult to deal with, or on the contrary, things might go well and, they may be pleasant. But ultimately, it is your attitude about those circumstances that really makes a difference. And there is actually some interesting evidence from modern psychology that backs up Seneca's point. Psychologists have discovered that people tend to have a set point for happiness, that happiness is actually not really very responsive to external events. If you go through a tragedy, sure, immediately you will be sad, you'll be depressed and all that sort of stuff. But eventually, most people bounce back to previous levels of happiness or contentness pretty quickly. And vice versa, if you are if fortune smiles on you and let's say you win the lottery and you have a lot of money all of a sudden, yes, initially you're elated and things are looking good. But then eventually you go back pretty quickly, within weeks or months, you go back to your set point because how happy and content you are in your life, as Seneca puts it, depends really on how you handle the situation, not very specifically about the situation itself. Now, Seneca tells his mother that wisdom lies in knowing that fortune is fickle, and therefore that you need to treat fortune accordingly. You never trust fortune, according to the Stoics. Your luck is it's a undependable companion, as the Frank Sinatra song puts it. He goes on to say, always stand, as it were, on guard, and mark the attacks and charges of fortune long before she delivers them. She is only terrible to those whom she catches unawares. He who is always looking out for her assault easily sustains it. So the notion here is that you have to prepare your mind to withstand adversity. Not because you need to be pessimistic, about things. So you mean that I have to always think about things going for the worse? That's just life. Things at some point will get worse. Things at some point will have, you will face in adversity. You will face loss. You will face setbacks. This is just the way life works. And so if you're mentally prepared for it, however, again, there is evidence not just from Seneca, but from modern psychology, that you're far more capable of withstanding the impact of the adversity or of the setback than if you just go around gingerly thinking that nothing is ever gonna go bad in your life. Seneca continues by telling his mother that no matter where we are and what our situation may be, we will always have two faithful companions. And he says, whithersoever we betake ourselves, two most excellent things will accompany us, namely a common nature and our own special virtue. Now, what does he mean by that? Our common nature is the nature of social beings capable of reason. That's human nature. Right? We are, especially according to the Stoics, essentially defined by the fact that we are social and we're capable of reason. And our common nature accompanies us everywhere. That is, we have those two things, the ability to reason and the ability to be social, as part of who we are. It doesn't matter what the external circumstances are, they will always be with us. And then the second thing that he mentions, our special virtue, that is our character. And our character also accompanies us wherever we go. And basically what Seneca is saying is that no circumstances can deprive us of those two things. No circumstance can take away our character. No circumstance can take away our common human nature. And these are the things that will help us getting through any setback or any tragedies, precisely because we are virtuous, which for the Stoic just means we have a good character, we have good judgment. It's our good judgment that allows us to deal with situations. And it is the fact that we can reason through our problems and the fact that we can count on other people because we're social animals that will get us through whatever befalls us. Seneca then reminds his mother that we are all in this together, and that our best bet is to create a society wherever we happen to be. He says, quote, "No place of banishment can be found in the whole world in which we cannot find a home." And sure enough, as soon as the pandemic, I'm talking about the COVID pandemic now, hit, what do? We form new societies by technological means like Zoom. We're in one of those societies right now, right? You guys cannot meet in person, and that's unfortunate. It's certainly not ideal, but we immediately came up with alternatives. We immediately tried to do what? To keep in touch with other people, to keep the human connection with other people. And that is what has happened. A lot of people, helped a lot of people during the pandemic. I mentioned earlier on Musonius Rufus, one of the Stoics who was sent into exile. He was the one sent to the little barren island of Gyara in the Aegean Sea. And what did he do? As soon as he got there, he was there with a few exiles. He immediately created a social group. He immediately created a little philosophy school and started teaching and talking to other people. So that's how he got through the exile, by making himself useful and by renewing or reestablishing contacts with other people. Seneca says that we are often the cause of our own unhappiness because we value things that are not really that important. We are doomed, he says, by our greed, extravagance, and constant quest for pleasure. Here's another quote. He says, "How unhappy are they whose appetite can only be aroused by costly food. And the costliness of food depends not upon its delightful flavor and sweetness of taste, but upon its rarity and the difficulty of procuring it." Does that sound familiar? Stoicism is not very friendly to consumerism in general. And, I live in New York, and sure enough, I do appreciate, the fact that there is a varied restaurant scene here and all that. But what happened as soon as the pandemic hit and we couldn't, with my wife, we couldn't go to restaurants? Well, we started cooking. We both like cooking, and we varied our cooking as much as possible. In other words, you appreciate things that you have in life, but you don't depend on them, right? One of the reasons to live in New York certainly is because there is such a varied, culinary culture scene, musical scene, etc. But if that's not available because there are special circumstances, then you don't focus on what you're missing. You focus on what you can do instead, on what you can replace it with, or what else you can do that is different and equally satisfying. From there, Seneca actually launches into something that had been written 2 millennia later will sound very much like an indictment of modern capitalism. Listen to this. He says, "Why do you amass fortune after fortune? Are you unwilling to remember how small our bodies are Is it not frenzy and the wildest insanity to wish for so much when you can contain so little? And then he goes back to his main theme of how to stand adversity. He says to his mother, the harder these things are to bear, the more virtue you must summon to your aid, and the more bravely you must struggle, as it were, with an enemy whom you know well and whom you have already often conquered. And then finally, he concludes his letter of consolation, remember, to his mother in a kind of an uplifting fashion. He says, I am as joyous and cheerful as in my best days. Indeed, these days are my best because my mind is relieved from all pressure of business and is at leisure to attend to its own affairs. And at one time amuses itself with lighter studies, at another eagerly presses its inquiries into its own nature and that of the universe. So basically what he's saying is, you know, it may be bad to be in exile, but I don't have all these people that want all these chunks of my time that bother me all the time. I can actually have time to sit down and read. I have time to sit down and write. I have time to do things that I actually postponed and wanted to do for a long time. And then finally, since I'm on my own, I have a little bit more peace of mind. I actually get to do them. Now, this is Seneca. In the next few minutes, before we open it up to discussion, I want to shift to a different author, Stoic author, and a different concept, which is one of the most important concepts and most useful concepts in the arsenal of Stoic philosophy. The philosopher is Epictetus, and the idea is sometimes referred to as the dichotomy of control. Here's how Epictetus himself puts the notion of the dichotomy of control. He says, some things are up to us, while others are not. Up to us are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not up to us are our body, property, reputation, office, and in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. Now, before I get a little bit more in detail and explain what exactly he means and why this is important, I'd like to mention that this notion of the dichotomy of control, it's not just a Stoic, it's actually found in a number of other cultures. It shows up in 8th century Buddhism, for instance, in 11th century Judaism, and even in 20th century Christianity. You may have heard the Serenity Prayer, which was written by American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr in 1934, and which is often used at the beginnings of 12-step organization meetings, such as Alcoholics Anonymous, right? And the Serenity Prayer goes like this. It says, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And that's exactly what Epictetus is saying there. He's saying some things are up to me, meaning I can change them. I can actually do stuff. And other things are not up to me. I can't do anything about it. I cannot act on those things. And the important thing is to differentiate those, to realize what is up to me and what is not up to me, and then focus on the things that are up to me and accept the rest with serenity, with, you know, with open-mindedness in a sense. So what does Epictetus say is actually up to us? He says opinion, motivation, desire, and aversion. What does that mean? Really, what it means is endorsed opinions, conscious motivations, values, the kind of stuff that we say to ourselves, yeah, I agree with this. In other words, judgments. The only thing that Epictetus thinks is really, truly up to us is our judgments and our decisions to act or not to act. Everything else, which he says includes body, property, reputation, and office, is not up to us. Meaning what? Meaning that we can influence other things, like, for instance, our health, our possessions, our wealth, our reputation, our career, but we don't ultimately determine them. How is that possible? Well, let me give you an example that has to do, of course, with a pandemic. So if we're talking about a pandemic, let's talk about one of the things that Epictetus says is not up to us, health. Now, you might think, what do you mean health is not up to me? Of course it is. I can go to the doctor regularly. I can follow a reasonable diet, healthy diet. I can exercise. I can do all sorts of things that will make my body better, my health better. Yes, you can, but notice that all of those are the results of your judgments and decisions to act or not to act, right? You made a judgment that, let's say, in order to preserve your health in a pandemic, you need to get vaccinated if you can, you need to wear a mask, you need to maintain social distance and all that sort of. Those are all your judgments. And those judgments result in decisions to act in a certain way. That is really up to you. What is not up to you is whether you get sick or not, because you could do all of those things and still get sick, because viruses are sneaky bastards. They can get you even if you do everything exactly right. I've just lost a friend a week ago that did exactly everything right, including vaccination, and yet the virus got him and he died as a result of it. So this can happen. Of course, if you do the right things, if you act in the proper way, then you greatly reduce the chances of the virus hitting you and getting into the ICU and so on and so forth. But you don't control it. And so what Epictetus is basically telling us is like, focus on what is up to you. That is, make the right judgments, act in the way that is most proper and most useful, and then just be prepared for the fact that in life sometimes things go your way and sometimes they don't. And accept that outcome with serenity, because you don't have a choice. You can either accept it with serenity or just kick and scream about it, but that's pretty much it. If outcomes are outcomes, that things are going to happen, right? So another way to look at what Epictetus is saying, and I'm going to conclude here, is that we should aim at internalizing our goals. What does that mean? Well, again, using the example of the COVID pandemic, obviously it comes natural to us to say, my goal is to survive this damn thing, right? To get to the other side of the tunnel, whenever that's going to be, and be fine. That's the goal. And that comes natural. But according to Epictetus, that's actually the wrong goal, because that's not up to us. We don't determine outcomes. What is really up to us is to internalize the goal, meaning what I want to do is to do my best in order to maximize my chances that I get to the end of the tunnel, still alive and kicking, right? That is, in other words, my intention to act as reasonably and properly as possible. That is what is up to me. And I can focus on that. And I need to develop this attitude of being happy with my intentions, not with the outcomes. My happiness, again, is an inside job. It depends on the fact that I am satisfied with what I'm doing because I'm doing my best. What else could I be doing other than my best? I cannot blame myself if things go badly, even though I've done my best, because I've done my best. That's it. That's the end of the story. So reorient our goals, reorient our hopes and desires to the internal decision-making process rather than to the external outcomes. And that is, of course, also the best way to maximize the chances that the external outcomes actually do go the way in which we prefer. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Massimo. Now, of course, I'd like to take some questions. And Joan can pick out people. If you want to make a comment, put it in the chat or hit the raise hand function on the reactions button on the bottom, and Joan will be able to see you and pick that out. And I see Sal added a comment in the chat, a quote from Seneca: "We are more often frightened than hurt. We suffer more in imagination than reality."
Right. That goes around the lines of the notion that happiness is largely an inside job, so to speak, rather than depending on outside circumstances. Now, of course, as I said before, that shouldn't be interpreted as saying that outside circumstances are irrelevant. That outside life is made of outside circumstances, right? So the notion is not that they're irrelevant, but the notion is that the outside circumstances are what they are, and what makes a difference in our life is how we deal with them.
What do you say to the common criticism that progress really depends on people expanding the range of what is within control and not accepting the reality as a given, sort of not coping, but continuing to fight? And doesn't a progressive mindset depend on, struggling with the outrage?
Right. Yeah, that's a common criticism of Stoicism, but frankly, it actually misunderstands the point. Because the point isn't just like, well, I'm sorry, I mean, the circumstances are irrelevant, I'm going to stand back and whatever happens, happens. That isn't the notion. The notion is that you certainly want to do whatever you can to improve the circumstances, both your own and especially those of other people, because Stoicism is a cosmopolitan philosophy. We're supposed to treat everyone else on earth as our brothers, sisters, or whatever other gender they decide they prefer. So the notion is that of course you want to struggle. Remember, I told you that several of these people were either put to death or sent into exile because they actually dare challenge the emperor, right? That they saw, who they saw as a tyrant. So the notion is that you of course try to make things better. However, there is always a limit to what you can actually do as a human being. Sometimes you will succeed, in which case, good. But if you don't succeed, then the notion is you just accept it, pick it up, and try again. Right? Instead of getting mad, you just say, okay, well, this time I didn't win. Next time around.
Alice? I'm sorry, Maximo.
No, that's
Alice,
okay.
Alice, you're next. Unmute. And then Linda.
A specific situation, I was wondering how you deal with it, because I have a lot of trouble watching the news and things like the New Yorkers may be able to carry guns soon, abortion rights may be gone, and things like that. What do you say to yourself after you watch the news?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually suggest to my students, I advise my students not to watch that many news or read that many things. Now, of course, you do want to stay informed about what happens in the world, especially in your own community. So to some extent, you have to kind of keep up with it. But a lot of us, sort of liberal, progressive kinds of people, we kind of get obsessed with the news. I used to listen to NPR every morning and then every night, and then read the New York Times, and then reading the Nation, and reading this and that and the other, and then at the end of the day, you get depressed because most of the news are not good. Not only you get depressed, but again, you also cannot really do much about it. So you read, let's say, an article like the one you're talking about, oh well, maybe guns are going to be able, people are going to be able to carry open guns in New York soon. So you get upset. Well, can you actually do anything about it? If it's not an actionable piece of news, then you should probably set it aside. In this particular case, it's not actionable. There's nothing you can do because this is a result. This is a result of the Supreme Court. Of course, the next time around, when it comes to elections, let's say, then you can do something about it. You can campaign for politicians that are in favor of gun control. You can give money to causes that deal with gun control. So listen less to news and act more on the parts of those news that really upset you, right? So if there is something that upset you, instead of getting more and more detail and listening to it in a passive fashion, because then at the end of the day, you can't do much about it and you just get upset, make a note and say, okay, this pissed me off, so I'm going to send money to an anti-gun lobby or to a politician that opposes these kind of things. So pick battles more than listen to things or read things. Again, within limits. The suggestion here is not to ignore the news entirely. It's just to pare it down and to go on a diet in a sense, because when we overdo it on news, then the result is simply that we get depressed and frustrated, and that's not conducive to a good quality of life, and it's also not useful. You're not getting anything done when you're depressed.
Linda, unmute, and you're the next question.
Hi, Massimo. Thank you
Hi.
so much for coming back. I think my question sort of piggybacks on what Alice said. What I see is kind of what I define as the siege mentality, that people are always expecting the worst to happen, even when there's no sign of it. And I'm not talking about the pandemic, but I think the pandemic kind of caused friends, relatives that I know who are immediately get emotional when you just start talking about something, and the worst is going to happen, and we have no control over anything. And so Stoicism obviously addresses this sort of thing, but you know, can you speak a little bit more about how to talk to someone who's feeling that way?
Well, yeah, you make a good point, and in a sense, the answer is very similar to the one that I just gave a minute ago, right? That is like detach yourself a little bit. But again, I want to be clear what I mean when I say detach. Detach doesn't mean don't care, don't give a crap about stuff. For the Stoics, we have a duty to care about other people and about society at large. We have a duty to do something in order to make the world a better place. What we don't have is a duty to pay attention to every single detail of what's going on, because that becomes overwhelming and that becomes paralyzing. That generates that kind of attitude that you're talking about, is like, oh my gosh, everything is going bad. So what am I doing here, right? And that leads often to paralysis and possibly even to nihilism. Because say, well, okay, that's it. I give up, right? There's nothing I can do. So my friend and co-author Greg Lopez, for instance, he's the co-author of the first book that I put into the chat, the Handbook for New Stoics. What he does, he's very politically active, but he decided years ago that the best way to be politically active is at a local level. That is, in terms of national issues, sure, of course you go and vote, no question about it. That's I think a duty as a citizen of a democratic nation. You need to go and vote, and occasionally, send money to a national level politician. But your influence, your impact on national level elections and issues is negligible. It's very tiny, and yet we tend to focus on those because those are the big pictures, right? Instead, what Greg has done is to focus to use his money and time that he can devote to political issues at a local level. So he writes to very local level politicians, he interacts with them, he calls them constantly, develops relationships with them, he gives money to them. Why? Because he can be much more effective. If you're talking about like a borough level or a local administrative level, now we're talking about only a few thousand people who are going to go and vote at the election, and your vote really will make a difference. Your money really will make a difference. And in fact, he's been able to actually help some of these people even craft legislation at a local level. And let's not forget, of course, that all national politicians, at least of them, come from the local level. I mean, you start local and then eventually you make it to the national stage, with some exceptions, of course. So my suggestion would be to cut a lot of the noise out. Again, not because you don't care, but because when the noise becomes overwhelming, that becomes paralyzing, and therefore it's self-defeating. Focus instead on a few things that you really care about, especially at the local level. Try to maximize your impact. Focus on things where your agency is maximized, where you can actually make a difference. And the rest, I mean, it's a large society. We'll take care of it, but you don't have to do everything.
Frank, if you unmute, and you're up next, Frank.
First of all, thank you so much for your very enlightening and interesting talk. I learned a tremendous amount, and I already had some background in this, but I learned a lot from you. I was wondering if you could talk about why Stoicism eventually fell out of fashion in the ancient world, only to be rediscovered in modern times, more by the cognitive psychology movement and some of the other psychological movements. And maybe just talk briefly about any of the criticisms of Stoic philosophy, the main ones by philosophers, psychologists, and in your opinion, do they have any merit?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually more than one question, but they're all good. So why did Stoicism sort of tapered off as a philosophy of life? Pretty much by the end of the 2nd century, early 3rd century. Well, I think for the same reason that every other Hellenistic philosophy died out, Epicureanism, Aristotelianism, Platonism, and so on. That's the rise of Christianity and the fall of the Roman Empire eventually. Stoicism was one of the two major philosophies. The other one was Epicureanism, that was very common among the Romans. And the rise of Christianity really undermined all of these. Initially, Christianity was a competitor for these philosophies. Eventually, once the Christians took hold of the Roman Empire with Constantine, with the Emperor Constantine, then that was the end, pretty much the end. They started using Roman roads and Roman armies to pretty much eliminate all the competition. And finally was one of the Byzantine, Eastern Roman emperors who actually literally closed all the philosophy schools, including the last one, which was Plato's Academy. So that's the reason. But Stoic ideas, as well as other ideas like ideas from Aristotle, Plato themselves, they actually influenced Christianity quite a bit. And so the reason I think that one of the reasons Stoicism reemerged in the 20th century is because these ideas have actually been hanging around for a long time in one form or another. All of the early Christian fathers were very familiar with Stoic writings, and they engaged with Stoic writings directly. There was a lot in Stoicism that Christianity absorbed. For instance, Thomas Aquinas, arguably the most important Christian theologian of the Middle Ages, came up with this list of canonized, basically, he didn't actually come up with it, but he canonized the list of the 7 Christian virtues. And the 7 Christian virtues are practical wisdom, courage, justice, temperance, hope, faith, and charity. Now, the first 4 are the Stoic virtues. They're the cardinal virtues recognized by the Stoics. So they just got incorporated straight into Christianity. As I said, the Serenity Prayer pretty much is the same thing as the dichotomy of control, and it goes back 2,000 years. So there is that. In terms of criticism of Stoicism in modern times, yeah, there's a lot of criticism of Stoicism actually, because as soon as an idea gets popular, then immediately people start, wanting to criticize it, and fair enough. Some of these criticisms are based on misunderstandings. I mentioned one before, that is this notion that Stoicism is kind of a quietist philosophy, that it's about not giving a crap. It's like, no, that's definitely very clearly not the case. However, some of the other criticisms are actually, I think, on target. For instance, there is one that's particularly important. Epictetus, at in 2 or 3 places in the Discourses and the Enchiridion, which are the 2 books that summarize his teachings, he says something on the lines of, remember that when you kiss goodnight to your wife or your child, remember that they are human beings and therefore mortals. And should they die, then you would not be disturbed. And it's like, wait, what? Wait a minute. What do you mean I should not be disturbed by the fact that my loved ones might die? What kind of psychopath is this guy, right? Well, in the time of Epictetus, this made perfect sense, because the Stoics believed in a type of providence, not quite like the Christian providence, but they did believe that the universe is a living organism endowed with reason, what's sometimes referred to as the logos, and that we are literally bits and pieces of that universe, and therefore that everything that happens to us is for the good of the universe. Epictetus uses this wonderful metaphor to explain the concept. He says, imagine you are just like a foot that is about to step into the mud. Now, if you look at the situation just from the point of view of the foot, that's disgusting. Why would I want to step into the mud? I don't want to do that. But if you remember that you are not just a foot, but you're connected to a body, and the body has to get home, and the only way for the body to get home is for you to step into the mud, then not only you're going to do it, but you're going to be happy doing it, because this is your duty. This is who you are. This is your bit in the general scheme of things. So similarly, when he says, you shouldn't be disturbed if your loved ones are dying, is because according to him, his way of looking at things, everything that happens is for the good of the universe. It might not be pleasant for you. It might be painful for you, but in fact, it has a reason. And it's a beautiful idea. Unfortunately, it doesn't stand up to modern scrutiny, because as a scientist in the 21st century, I don't believe that the universe is a living organism of which we are bits and pieces. Yes, we're connected to the rest of the cosmos, but only in the sense of cause and effect, only in a basic physical sense. We're not, I don't recognize that view of the universe. Therefore, I cannot go along with Epictetus when he says that we shouldn't be, concerned about these things. In fact, that we should embrace them. That's not feasible. And so that is one thing that modern Stoics are trying to modify, to change in terms of their philosophy.